I am Reed. I am 27, just an average dude. I've made tons of money mistakes in my 20s, and now I want to share everything I've learned to help you take control of your finances and your life. Welcome back, everyone, man. Thank you so much for being here, for taking the time out of your day. And a special shout out to those of you who become new subscribers on my Patreon or Substack. Seriously, it was awesome to see so many of you jump on those platforms after my last announcement. It's great knowing we can stay connected, especially if things ever get weird on YouTube. Like gotta have a backup plan for everything these days, right? Just like you need an emergency fund, you need a backup plan for your favorite content creators. Anyway, let's dive into something today that honestly is kind of freaking me out a little bit. For decades, Japan has been this super quiet financial giant, and that is not just me saying it. Their economy grew slowly. Inflation was practically non-existent, and interest rates stayed close to zero for years. It was like this perfectly calm lake on the surface. But underneath, man, Japan became one of the most crucial pillars holding up the entire global financial system. And right now, that pillar, that whole foundation, might be starting to shift. It might even be cracking. And if it does, the shockwaves are going to hit the United States and the global economy harder than a bad financial decision from my early 20s. And trust me, I made some doozies. Most people, myself included, until I started digging into this, think that China has the biggest foreign influence on US markets. And yeah, China's big, but Japan might be even more important. Get this. Japan holds roughly $1.2 trillion in US Treasury bonds. That makes them America's largest foreign creditor. They basically lend us more money than anyone else. Think about that for a second. At the same time, Japan has this massive domestic bond market worth around $8 trillion. That is the third largest bond market in the world. For years, Japanese investors and institutions were like this constant source of cheap money for global markets. They invested heavily in foreign assets, especially in American government bonds and stocks. And this system worked really well because Japan kept its interest rates incredibly low for a super long time. Like for decades, the Bank of Japan, their central bank, just flooded the financial system with cheap money. They were trying to fight deflation, trying to get their economy moving. So what happened? Japanese investors could borrow money at basically zero interest, and then they de-invest that money in higher yielding assets overseas, which obviously they did. A no-brainer, right? This whole thing became known as the yen carry trade, and it turned Japan into one of the biggest sources of liquidity for global markets. It was like they had an endless money faucet turned on, and everyone else was benefiting from the cheap flow. But here's the kicker, guys. That era, it's ending. No, seriously. It is ending, if we being realistic. Remember, back in 2024, this is super important for context. The Bank of Japan officially ditched one of the most extreme monetary policies in modern history, their yield curve control policy, for years. The BOJ basically just put their foot on the neck of Japanese government bond yields, keeping long-term rates artificially close to zero. It was wild. But then inflation in Japan finally started to creep up. It actually started moving towards the central bank's 2% target rate, and facing all this growing inflationary pressure, the Bank of Japan finally started letting interest rates rise, and the consequences, they were immediate. Japanese government bond yields shot up. Like the 10-year Japanese bond yields roughly doubled to over 2%, and the 20-year yields climbed above 3.5%. Now, to us, those numbers might still seem kind of low compared to what we see in the US or Europe, but for Japan, this was a seismic shift. A massive earthquake financially speaking. Japan had been stuck in this world of ultra-low rates for decades, and now investors were suddenly facing a totally different reality. It is like if you've been driving on a perfectly smooth, flat road for 30 years, and then suddenly you are doing off-roading. It changes everything. And at the same time, Japan's political leadership started shifting in a more aggressive direction. Prime Minister Takaichi, she came into power promising massive economic stimulus. And she delivered. Man, she pledged roughly $134 billion in new spending, which is like 3% of Japan's entire GDP. Think about that. She also proposed pausing an 8% food import tax for 2 years, trying to cut food prices and ease the pressure on households that are already getting hammered by inflation. Which on the surface sounds good, right? Like, hey, let us help the people. But this big stimulus push is happening at a really dangerous moment for Japan. Finances, Japan already has the highest debt burden in the entire developed world, higher than the United States. Even their public debt is sitting around 230% of Japan's GDP. That is insane, man. Seriously, it is way higher than what we have in the US or European countries. And unlike economies that are growing fast, Japan has some serious demographic problems. Their population is shrinking, and it is aging super rapidly, which makes long-term economic growth way harder to achieve. So, you've got inflation rising on one side, and on the other, the government wants to spend even more money while also putting pressure on the central bank to keep interest rates low. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Takaichi has even nominated 2 people who are known as doves on monetary policy to the Bank of Japan's board, and that sends a clear signal that she wants looser monetary policy to support her economic plans. And guess what else? The Japanese yen has already weakened dramatically against the US dollar. It fell to levels we haven't seen in decades. A weak currency makes imports more expensive, especially things like energy and food, which, you guessed it, can push inflation even higher. It's a vicious cycle, guys. So now investors are starting to wonder if Japan can actually keep managing its massive debt burden if borrowing costs keep going up. It is like asking if I can keep paying off my credit cards if the interest rate suddenly triples. It gets dicey real fast. And this, my friends, is where the story becomes super important for us in the United States. If Japanese bond yields keep rising, Japanese investors might start pulling their money out of U.S. financial markets and bringing it back home for years. U.S. Treasury bonds looked amazing compared to Japan's near zero yields. Like, why would you invest in something that pays nothing when you can get a decent return here? But if Japanese government bonds now start offering competitive returns, and there's a chance the yen will strengthen, a lot of Japanese investors might decide there is less reason to hold on to American assets. And this process, called capital repatriation, could have huge consequences for us markets. The timing, honestly, couldn't be worse for Washington. The U.S. government already needs to finance these enormous deficits because we've been operating in the red for decades. America has to issue trillions of dollars in new debt, while also refinancing a crazy amount of existing treasury bonds that are coming due. If one of the world's biggest foreign buyers starts backing away from this market, borrowing costs in the United States could jump even higher, and it is not just the treasury market at risk, by the way. The unwinding of that Japanese carry trade I talked about, it could drain liquidity from global financial markets across the board. For over a decade, that cheap Japanese money helped fuel investments in stocks, real estate, and all sorts of risky assets around the world. If that flow reverses, which it is looking like it will, financial conditions could tighten up really fast. Some analysts are now drawing some uncomfortable comparisons to periods right before past financial crises. For example, a guy named Albert Edwards, a well-known strategist, recently warned that the sharp rise in global bond yields looks a lot like the conditions we saw before the 2008 financial crisis. I actually just recorded a whole interview with the economist Michael Hudson, who laid it all out for us in crazy detail, and I highly recommend you watch that one. Next, he pointed out that 30-year U.S. Treasury yields recently climbed above 5.2%. Those are levels last seen in mid-2007, just before the housing crisis spiraled into a global meltdown. Man, chills. Back then, markets totally ignored the warning signs. Stocks kept climbing for a while, even as bond yields shot up, but eventually, rising borrowing costs started really hurting the economy. Corporate profits weakened, fears of a recession spread, and then, boom, financial markets collapsed. That was 2008. Well, Professor Hudson believes something similar could totally happen again today. He argues that surging bond yields will spell the end of the global economy as we know it. And as Japan has become one of these central pressure points in the global financial system, the cracks are just getting wider and wider. As the Bank of Japan slowly backs away from its ultra-loose monetary policy, Japanese bond yields are rising fast. This shift is pushing global yields higher and tightening financial conditions across all markets, making the situation even worse. Long-term interest rates matter a ton because they affect almost every single part of the economy. Not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy. 2. Higher bond yields mean higher mortgage rates for you and me, higher borrowing costs for corporations, higher government financing expenses, and they put a lot of pressure on stock market valuations. A lot of that massive asset boom we've seen over the past decade was built on the idea that money would just stay cheap forever. If that era is ending now, investors are going to have to completely rethink how assets are priced. Adding to all this pressure are growing inflation concerns linked to geopolitical tensions, especially rising energy prices connected to the instability in the Middle East and, the ongoing conflicts. Persistent inflation creates an absolute nightmare scenario for central banks because it limits their ability to cut interest rates, even if economic growth slows down. So this whole combination, rising yields, slowing growth, stubborn inflation, massive government debt, this exact combination is what is really worrying a lot of market strategists today. There are essentially two paths forward for Japan. In the best-case scenario, Japan moves super carefully. The government scales back some of its stimulus plans, while the Bank of Japan keeps gradually normalizing interest rates. In this outcome, the yen could still strengthen, inflation might stabilize, and Japan could avoid a full-blown debt crisis. But even this good scenario could still hurt us markets because Japanese investors might keep bringing their money home, keep repatriating their funds back to Japan, which reduces demand for American bonds and could push us borrowing costs even higher. So even if they play it perfectly, we still feel the pinch. Now, there's also a bad scenario, and I gotta share this with you. In the worst-case scenario, Japan aggressively pushes its stimulus plans while pressuring the Bank of Japan to keep rates artificially low. Is Prime Minister Takaichi going to do that? We don't know yet, but if they do, investors could lose confidence in Japan's debt sustainability, and that could trigger a bond market crisis, which, in turn, would lead to a sharp decline in their currency. Such a crisis might temporarily slow the capital repatriation into Japan, but it could also expose bigger concerns about unsustainable government debt across the entire developed world, including right here in the United States. And that, I think, is the deeper message emerging from today's bond market turmoil. For more than a decade, global markets have been operating in this environment of cheap money. Central banks kept rates near zero, governments racked up enormous debt, and investors just got used to this endless liquidity that supported asset prices. But now inflation is coming back. Bond yields are rising. In fact, they're resurging. And the true cost of debt is becoming impossible to ignore. Japan may simply be the first major domino to fall, showing us what happens when that old system starts to crack. For investors and policymakers alike, ignoring Japan right now could be a very, very costly mistake. I'm going to be writing more about this over on my Substack. I know a lot of you are probably super interested in this topic, and so I'll develop it and discuss it in much more detail as time goes by, and as we hear more about the Bank of Japan's next steps. If you appreciate this content, if you are interested in keeping your money safe and making smart decisions, then like, subscribe, and share this video. And I will see you tomorrow in my new one. Peace.